Hi, I'm Jesse Alexander and welcome to the Great War. The peace settlements after 1918 had divided up the former Ottoman territories in the Middle East into British and French mandates. Britain took control of mandatory Palestine, but the territory would prove very difficult to govern. One of the flashpoints was Zionist Jewish settlement of the Holy Land, a controversial topic today and back in 1921. So in this episode, we'll take a look at the practical implications of Jewish settlement in Palestine after 1918 and the violence that resulted. And it all happened exactly 100 years ago. To understand the clashes in Palestine in 1921, we've got to go back to 19th century Europe and the idea of Zionism. Nationalist concepts often excluded Jews, and in Russia and parts of Eastern Europe, there were regular outbreaks of anti-Semitic violence. These became more intense after the assassination of Tsar Alexander II in 1881, even though his assassin was not Jewish. Faced with discrimination and pogroms, Jewish thinkers like Theodor Herzl began to theorize about a Jewish national home where Jews could live in peace and security. This was the origin of the modern Zionist movement, which at first considered numerous places around the world for a possible Jewish homeland before Ottoman Palestine became the most popular option. In 1896, Herzl published The Jewish State, an attempt at a modern solution to the Jewish question, in which he envisioned a sovereign Jewish state formed by migration in Palestine or possibly Argentina. Not all Jews supported Zionism, but it gained influence quickly. Jews had lived in Palestine from ancient times, and 19th century European Jews had been migrating before Zionism, but it wasn't a national movement. Most migrants were elderly Jews who wanted to live out their final years in the holy cities. But by the eve of the First World War, many younger Jews who identified as Zionists began to arrive. Some of them brought socialist ideas from Europe and formed communal settlements known as kibbutz. Although exact numbers are disputed, around 40,000 Jews arrived between 1909 and 1918, which nearly doubled the Jewish population to 85,000. Jews represented about 10% of the population, while the other 90% was mostly Arab Muslims and Christians. Some Zionists weren't worried about the Arab majority. In fact, in 1909, Zionist activist David Ben-Gurion thought that Arabs would benefit as well. The Jewish settlement is not designed to undermine the position of the Arab community. On the contrary, it will salvage it from its economic misery, lift it from its social decline, and rescue it from physical and moral degeneration. Our Renaissance in Palestine will come through the country's regeneration, that is, the Renaissance of its Arab inhabitants. Many Arabs felt otherwise, like the editors of the Philistine newspaper in 1914. We are a nation threatened with disappearance by the Zionist tide in this Palestinian land, a nation which is threatened in its very being with expulsion from its homeland. So by 1914, 19th century European nationalism and anti-Semitism had caused some Jews to seek a new homeland in Arab-majority Palestine. The outbreak of the First World War stopped Jewish migration for a few years, but British wartime promises set the stage for more conflict. From 1914 to 1918, people in Palestine suffered from wartime shortages, and the region became a battlefield in the last 2 years of the war. It also became a focus of international politics thanks to the Balfour Declaration of November 1917. British Foreign Minister Arthur Balfour sent a one-sentence telegram to the Zionist Federation of Great Britain that would have a lasting impact. His Majesty's government view with favour the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people, and will use their best endeavours to facilitate the achievement of this object, it being clearly understood that nothing shall be done which may prejudice the civil and religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine, or the rights and political status enjoyed by Jews in any other country. The Zionist movement appeared to have gained Britain's support, But although some British ministers were sympathetic, the declaration was about wartime strategy. Many Britons believed Jews were influential in the United States and in revolutionary Russia, and hoped that the declaration might help the war effort against Germany. British anti-Semites also supported the declaration in the hopes it might reduce the Jewish presence in Britain. Some prominent British Jews, like Chaim Weizmann, helped bring about the declaration as well. Weizmann was an important chemist for British war production, and he convinced Balfour, Prime Minister David Lloyd George, and Winston Churchill of the Zionist cause. The British government, however, had also made other promises for Palestine. They discussed a pan-Arab state with the Hashemite dynasty and post-war League of Nations mandates with the French. The British tried to untie this Gordian knot at the Paris Peace Conference in 1919. Weizmann met with Hashemite heir Faisal, and both issued statements supporting the Balfour Declaration. Faisal had this to say: "We Arabs, especially the educated among us, look with the deepest sympathy on the Zionist movement. Our deputation here in Paris is fully acquainted with the proposals submitted yesterday by the Zionist organization to the peace conference, and we regard them as moderate and proper. We will do our best, insofar as we are concerned, to help them through. We will wish the Jews a most hearty welcome home." It seemed that Zionists and Arabs might both get what the British had promised them, but things changed quickly. Once the peace conference came to an end, British support for a pan-Arab state disappeared, and they took control of Palestine via the League of Nations. A US commission found that the vast majority of Palestinian Arabs opposed Zionist settlement, but the British authorities began to act on the declaration anyway. Jewish migration and settlement in Mandatory Palestine resumed and expanded under the British regime. 35,000 Jews arrived between 1919 and 1923, mostly farmers from Eastern Europe. In 1920, the British reopened the old Ottoman land registry, which once again allowed land to be purchased. Jewish settlers bought large tracts of land, often helped by international organizations like the Jewish National Fund, the Palestinian Colonization Association, and the World Zionist Organization. Throughout the 1920s, Jewish financial inflows were on average 40% higher than Palestine's actual domestic product. But this land did not come cheap. In Ottoman times, local peasant farmers often didn't register the land in their own names because they were afraid of extra taxes or military service. Wealthier city residents registered the land in their name in exchange for tools or animals for the peasants. Now the landowners in Damascus or Beirut sold their holdings to Jewish settlers for exorbitant prices. Much of the land bought by settlers was sparsely populated and undesirable swamps or marshland. In September 1921, for example, settlers acquired around 72,000 square kilometers of the Yisrael Valley from the Lebanese Sursuk family for £726,000. Within months, numerous settlements were founded and the swamp was turned into fertile farmland. Other areas settled by Jews were also inhabited by Arab families, some of whom had been there for centuries. The socialist Zionists brought with them the ideology of Hebrew labor, in which only Jewish farmers could tend the land of Jewish settlements. Since hiring Arab labor constituted a forbidden hierarchical relationship, Zionists introduced a system of segregation in which Arab farmers were dispossessed and evicted. Although some received compensation, those who refused were often ejected by British forces at the request of the settlers. Even pro-Zionist Britons in the Mandatory government realized that such actions would lead to conflict, like the legal official who made this observation. The settlements created a policy of economic apartheid, which was bound to strengthen the resistance of Arabs to Jewish immigration. So the British Mandatory government in Palestine was in theory objective, but in practice it supported Jewish migration and passed laws which made it harder for Arabs to expand the lands that they owned. But not all British leaders were in favor of cooperating with Zionist organizations. Groups like the Zionist Commission had been working with the British since the beginning of the Mandate, while Weizmann promoted their cause in London. But they couldn't convince all British leaders to support them. Chief Administrator in Palestine, General Louis Bowles, complained to Lloyd George about Zionist activities in March 1920. My own authority, and that of every department of my administration, is claimed or impinged upon by the Zionist Commission. It is of no use saying to the Muslim and Christian elements of the population that our declaration as to the maintenance of the status quo on our entry into Jerusalem has been observed. Facts witness otherwise. On the other hand, the Zionist Commission accuses me and my officers of being anti-Zionism. The situation is intolerable. It is manifestly impossible to please partisans who officially claim nothing more than a national home, but in reality will be satisfied with nothing less than a Jewish state, and all that politically implies. Eventually, Bowles called for the Balfour Declaration to be revoked, but his military administration was replaced by a civilian one led by High Commissioner Sir Herbert Samuel in July 1920. Samuel was a British Jew and an enthusiastic Zionist. The policy of His Majesty's government that I had come here to execute is to encourage the immigration of Jews until a point shall be reached at which their interests shall be sufficiently predominant to warrant the establishment of Jewish government in Palestine. Most Arabs were dismayed with an openly Zionist British High Commissioner, but Zionist groups celebrated his arrival, and Weizmann even took credit for it. I was mainly responsible for the appointment of Sir Herbert Samuel to Palestine. Sir Herbert Samuel is our friend. At our request, he accepted that difficult position. We put him in that position. He is our Samuel. So by mid-1920, the pro-Zionist British Mandatory Government increased cooperation with Zionist groups like the Jewish Assembly of Representatives. At the same time, the British denied similar access to Arab groups like the Palestine Arab Congress. Palestinian leaders and intellectuals complained bitterly about British policy. They pointed to the lack of progress towards the promised pan-Arab state and felt that Palestine was treated differently than the other mandates because of Zionist interference. Writer Musa Kazim al-Husseini was part of a delegation that met with Colonial Minister Winston Churchill in August 1921. Since Palestine opened its doors to Jewish settlers, its trade has gradually drifted into their hands. They depreciate the value of land and property, and at the same time manipulate a financial crisis in order that landlords under the stress of need should sell out at ruinous prices. Can Europe then expect the Arabs to live and work with such a neighbor? Had not England better find a country for them in the vast, uninhabited regions of her great empire? Churchill reiterated that Zionism should also benefit the Arabs, but he made it clear that British policy would not change. The British government means to carry out the Balfour Declaration. I have told you so again and again. I told you so at Jerusalem. I told you so at the House of Commons the other day. I tell you so now. We intend to bring more Jews in. We do not intend you to be allowed to stop more from coming in. During the early years of the British Mandate, conditions in Palestine like education, life expectancy, and agriculture had improved, which also fueled Arab immigration from neighboring areas. But it's debated to what extent these improvements in the quality of life were due to Jewish development, which was mostly limited to areas they settled. Conditions had already been improving under the Ottomans before the war, and infrastructure improvements in the Mandate were funded by the British. But some Jews, like Palestinian-born Yitzhak Epstein, felt that material improvements could not heal the rift with the Arabs. Indeed, the Jewish Yeshuv has already bestowed considerable bounty on the country's inhabitants. But all of this will not compensate for what we have subverted. How strong is the envy of people who have been swept off their land? The British administration did eventually offer Palestinian Arab leaders a representative assembly with a Muslim majority, but it would be purely advisory and have no actual powers. The Palestinians refused because they felt that accepting would be a tacit acceptance of the Balfour Declaration. Palestinian political opposition to Zionism failed to stop Jewish migration for different reasons. The British refused to accredit Arab congresses, the Palestinians were divided on whether they wanted a Palestinian or pan-Arab state and along tribal lines, and the British mandatory government gradually removed pro-Arab administrators. So Palestinian Arabs were unhappy with British support for Zionism and the lack of Arab representation. The tensions soon turned violent, and riots broke out in February and May 1920. But events in May 1921 overshadowed all previous incidents. Like the British and the Arab Palestinians, Zionist Jewish settlers were also divided amongst themselves. Relations were especially bad between two socialist parties. The mostly Russian Jewish Socialist Workers' Party wanted a Soviet Palestine, an idea opposed by the much larger Labour Unity Party. On May 1, 1921, demonstrators from the two parties collided in a mixed Arab-Jewish quarter of the town of Jaffa. Scuffles broke out around the Hassan Bek Mosque, which brought concerned Muslim Arabs into the streets as well. Not only were most of the Arabs opposed to Jewish migration, but also to the anti-religious teachings of Bolshevism, and police struggled to keep the three groups apart. A shot was fired, probably by a British officer trying to disperse the crowd, and the riot turned deadly. Groups of Arabs, including some policemen, targeted Jewish homes and families in the neighborhood, killing and looting as they went. A British officer who was on holiday and witnessed the scene reflected on the dilemma for British troops on the ground. When we found it was a question between the Jews and the Arabs, we did not think it was for us to interfere. Which were we to stop? By the end of the day, 27 Jews were killed and more than 100 wounded. On May 2nd, the violence continued, including an armed response by Jews. Underground defense groups known as Haganah that had been formed in 1920 now sprang into action. Arab accounts of Jewish attacks on May 2nd read much like Jewish accounts of Arab attacks the previous day. Although the Haganah officially forbade acts of revenge, Jewish groups beat and shot Arabs who they thought were involved in the previous day's violence. Over the next few days, the rioting spread to neighboring villages. When a large group of Bedouin Arabs attacked the Jewish town of Petah Tikva, the British sent in aircraft to break up the attack. British reinforcements arrived and ended the riots within a week. By then, 47 Jews and 48 Arabs had been killed. Most of the Jews had been killed by Arabs, and most of the Arabs killed by British forces. The Jaffa riots shocked the Jewish community and British authorities and revealed just how fragile mandatory Palestine had become. On May 7th, High Commissioner Samuel ordered the first of what would become many commissions into Arab-Jewish violence. The Haycraft Commission of Inquiry lasted 10 weeks and heard 300 witnesses. The Chief Justice for Palestine's final report criticized the Arab community for their, quote, brutality and savagery. It also judged that Jews had acted in similar fashion, although, quote, they had much to revenge. Overall, Haycraft blamed the Arabs, though he did express some understanding for their motives. The primary cause of the disturbances was Arab discontent over the political and economic consequences of continued Jewish immigration, as well as a perceived pro-Jewish bias by the mandatory authorities. Jaffa was a likely flashpoint since about 1/3 of the town was Jewish, and it was the main port of entry for settlers. The report also warned and reminded British administrators that Palestinians were politically active. A small Muslim center of this sort of people are more politically minded than in a small English country town. and the discussions of politics is their chief, if not their only, intellectual occupation. Even though Haycraft blamed the Arabs for the riots, Arab leaders generally responded positively to the report because it appeared to legitimize their grievances. Zionists were mostly dismayed by the inquiry because its findings undermined their argument that Jews and Arabs could coexist peacefully. Some international Jewish newspapers, like the London Jewish Chronicle, criticized the British for holding the inquiry in the first place. Imagine the wild animals in a zoological garden springing out of their cages and killing a number of spectators, and a commission appointed to inquire into the causes of the disaster, reporting first and foremost that the animals were discontented with and hostile to the visitors who'd come to see them, as if it were not the first business of the keepers to keep, to know the habits and disposition of the animals, and to be sure that the cages were secure. The riots caused Samuel to temporarily suspend immigration and make some conciliatory gestures towards the Arabs, which appalled his fellow Zionists like David Ada. The word traitor crossed my lips. Jewish settlers feared more Arab attacks and worried that the British might abandon them, so some groups began to stockpile weapons. Back in London, Lloyd George, Churchill and Balfour met with Weizmann in July and assured him the Balfour Declaration would remain in place. When Weizmann alluded to Jewish gun running, Churchill responded, "We don't mind it, but don't speak of it." British support for Zionism in Palestine and the Jaffa riots in 1921 were signs of things to come. In 1922, Churchill wrote that the British did not intend to make Palestine, quote, as Jewish as England is English, and that Jewish migration would be limited to the, quote, economic absorptive capacity of the land. For Arabs, these vague promises were cold comfort. 1922 also saw the official start of the British mandate in Palestine, the wording of which included the Balfour Declaration verbatim and granted Zionist organizations quasi-governmental responsibilities. British protection had helped the Zionist movement achieve a degree of international legitimacy, but Palestine was becoming unstable and violent. Haganah founder Ze'ev Jabotinsky felt that the time had come to build a metaphorical wall around the settlers. Zionist colonization can proceed and develop only under the protection of a power that is independent of the native population, behind an iron wall, which the native population cannot breach. The years to come would put that idea to the test. The roots of the Middle East conflicts in the years after the Great War is an important topic, and that's why we made today's episode. But frankly, if we only made our living with YouTube, we couldn't do it with topics like this one, which is obviously kryptonite for the YouTube algorithm. History is, in the grand scheme of YouTube's gigantic reach, not sexy enough for advertisers, and it's a bit of a footnote actually, and it's certainly not going to go viral. That's why we use crowdfunding for projects like our new series on the Franco-Prussian War called Glory and Defeat. Without your support outside of YouTube, we wouldn't exist. Another pillar of support for us is Nebula, a creator-driven streaming platform which we built together with other educational YouTubers. On Nebula, you can watch all our content ad-free and support creators more directly than on YouTube. We'd like to thank Mark Newton for his help with this episode. And as usual, you can find all our sources for the episode in the video description. And if you want to support our channel, you can support us on Patreon, and the link for that is in the video description as well. I'm Jesse Alexander, and this is The Great War 1921, a production of Real-Time History and the only YouTube history channel that is resigned that the comment section is going to be a dumpster fire.